stay there for, so we'll get started quickly. I'll readjust him if he goes out of shot a bit later on. Where we were doing Lockwood, and it's chapter 7. It took us till midnight to dig the thing out. One of us stood guard, taking readings, while the others laboured with the tools. Every 10 minutes we swapped around. We used the spades and picks that had been discarded on the path to cut away the mud from metal deep in the pit at its centre and slowly expose the object's lid and sides. We rarely spoke. Silence enfolded us like a shroud. We heard nothing but the skrt, skrt, skrt of the tools and the earth. All was still. Occasionally we scattered salt and iron up and down the centre of the pit to keep the supernatural forces at bay. It seemed to work. It was 2 degrees colder in the pit than the path beyond, but the temperature remained steady. The buzzing noise I'd heard had gone. Albert Joplin, for whom the mysterious burial exerted a powerful fascination, remained with us for a while, flitting back and forth among the gravestones in a sense of high excitement. Finally, as the night darkened and the coffin rose clear of the earth, even he grew cautious. He remembered something important he had to do back at the chapel and departed. We were alone. Skrt, skrt, skrt. At last we finished. The object stood exposed. Lockwood lit another storm lantern and placed it in the mud near the centre of the pit. We stood a short way off, gazing at what we'd found. An iron box, about 6 feet in length, 2 feet wide, and just over a foot deep. Not any old box, in other words. As Lockwood had said, an iron coffin. The sides were practically caked with soily, grey, and sticky-looking mud. Where the grunge had come away, the surface of the box showed through. Rust bloomed on it like flowers of coral, the colour of dried blood. Once, presumably, its sides had been clean and straight, but the pressing earth and the weight of the years had contorted the box so that its vertical edges were skewed and the top sagged in the middle. I've seen lead coffins from Roman burials they find under the city with the exact same squashed look. One corner of the lid is so warped it's risen away from the side completely, leaving a narrow wedge of darkness. Remind me never to get buried in an iron coffin, George said. It gets so tatty. And it's no longer doing its job either, Lockwood added. Whatever's inside is finding its way out through that little gap. You all right, Lucy? I was swaying where I stood. No, I didn't feel great. My head pounded. I felt nauseous. The buzzing noise was back, and I had the sensation of invisible insects running up and down my skin. It was a powerful miasma, that feeling of deep discomfort you get only when a visitor is near. Powerful, despite all that iron. I'm fine, I said briskly. So, who's opening it? This was the big question. Good agency practice is set out in the Fitz Manual and dictates that only one person is directly in the line of fire when, quote, sealed chambers, i.e., tombs, coffins, and secret rooms, are opened up. The others stand to the side, weapons at the ready. Rotating this duty fairly is second only to the biscuit rule in terms of importance. That's a regular point of contention. Not me, Lockwood tapped the sewn-up claw marks on his coat front. I did Mrs. Barrett. Well, I did that trap door in Melmoth House. George? I did the secret room at the Savoy Hotel, George said. You remember, the one with the plague mark on the door? Oh, that was eerie. No, it wasn't. It wasn't haunted or secret. It was a laundry room filled with pants. But I didn't know that when I went in, did I? George protested. Tell you what, we'll toss for it. He rummaged deep in his trousers, producing a dirty-looking coin. What do you think, Luce? Heads or tails? I think heads. Interesting choice. Let's see. There was a blur of movement, too fast for the eye to follow. Ah, it's tails. Unlucky, Luce, here's the crowbar. Lockwood grinned. Nice try, George, but you're doing it. Let's fetch the tools and seals. Breathing a sigh of relief, I led the way to the duffel bags. George followed with ill grace. Soon as the silver seals, the knives, the crowbars, and all the rest of the equipment were in position beside the coffin. This won't be too tricky, Lockwood said. Look, the lid's hinged on its side. Opposite that, we've two latches, here and here, but one's already snapped. There's just the one by you, Lucy, still corroded shut. Quick bit of nifty crowbar work from George, and we're home free. He looked at us. Any questions? Yes, George said. Several. Where will you be standing? How far away? What weapons will you use to protect me when something horrible comes surging out? Lucy and I have got everything covered. Now. Also, if I don't make it back home, I've made a will. I'll tell you where to find it. Under my bed in the far corner, behind the box of tissues. Please, God, it won't come to that. Now, if you're ready. Is that some kind of inscription on the lid? I said. Now we'd come to the point. I was really alert, all my senses firing. See that bit of scratching there? Lockwood shook his head. Can't tell under all this mud. And I'm not going to start wiping it off. Come on, let's get this done. In fact, the lid of the coffin proved harder to force than Lockwood had anticipated. Quite apart from the corroded latch, the bloom of rust across the surface had bonded with the top and sides in several places. It took 20 minutes of laborious chipping with pocket knives and chisels before the hinges were loosed and freed. Right, Lockwood said, taking a final reading. It's looking good. Temperature still holding firm, and the miasma isn't any worse. Whatever's in there is keeping surprisingly quiet. Well, no time like the present. Lucy, let's take our positions. He and I went to the opposite ends of the coffin. I held our largest, strongest silver net chain, 4 feet in diameter. I unfolded it. I let it hang ready in my hands. Lockwood unclasped his rapier and held it with an angled western grip, ready for the quick attack. George, he said, it's over to you. George nodded. He closed his eyes and composed himself, then took up the crowbar. He flexed his fingers, rolled his shoulders, and did something with his neck that made it click. He approached the coffin, bent close, and set the end of the crowbar into the crack between the broken clamps. He wound his stance, waggled his bottom like a golfer about to take a swing. He took a deep breath, then pressed down on the bar. Nothing happened. He pressed again. No, the lid was twisted. Perhaps its contortions had jammed it shut. George pressed again. With a clang, the lid shot up. George's end of the bar shot down. George jerked backwards, lost his balance, and landed heavily on his backside in the mud, with glasses slightly askew. He sat himself up, stared stupidly down into the coffin, and screamed. Torch, Lucy, Lockwood said as he dived forward, shielding George with the blade of his rapier. But nothing had come out. No visitor, no apparition. The gleam of the letters shone on the inside of the lid, and also on something in the coffin, something reflecting a dark, glittering light. The torch was in my hand. I shone it full into the interior, on what was lying there. If you're easily icked out, you might want to skip the next 2 paragraphs, because the body staring back at me wasn't just bones, but a great deal more. That was the first surprise. There wasn't much that had decayed away. Ever left a banana under a sofa and forgotten about it? Well, then you know what that it soon goes black, then black and gooey, then black and shrunken right down. This guy, entombed in iron, was like a banana midway through the second stage, and the third. Torchlight glimmered on the dried and blackened skin, stretched tight above the cheekbones. In places it had cracked, and there was a neat hole in the centre of the forehead, around which the skin had entirely peeled away. Long hanks of white hair, colourless as glass, hung beside the head. The eye sockets were empty, dried lips had shrunk back, revealing gums and teeth. He wore the remnants of a purple cloak or cape, and beneath it an old-style black suit, stiff high collar, black Victorian cravat. His hands, bony these, cradled something shrouded in tattered white cloth. Whether because of the angle of the burial, or because of the movement of the earth in the long years since, the object had slid from beneath the cloth and was peeping out between skeletal fingers. It was a piece of glass, perhaps the width of a human head, with an irregularly shaped rim. It was quite black with dirt and mould, and yet the glass still glinted, and glinting, it caught my eye. Look! Look! What was that voice? Lucy, seal it up! Of course, it was Lockwood shouting. With that, I cast the silver chain net, uh, and the contents of the coffin were blotted out. So, what did you see, George? Lockwood asked. We were standing on the path now, drinking tea and eating sandwiches, which is with some of Saunders's team that he'd brought. A decent crowd had gathered: Saunders, Joplin, several workmen, and the night watch kids. Some because the fun was all over, others possibly in delayed response to George's scream. They all hung about the gravestones, staring at the pit, a safe distance from the chains, which shut the coffin lid. Just a corner, uh, just a corner of the chain net could be seen. I mean, I know Bickerstaff looked bad, Lockwood went on, but let's face it, we've seen nastier. Remember Putney Vale? George had been very subdued for the last few minutes. He had barely spoken, and there was an odd expression on his face. His eyes showed numb distress, but they also held a yearning, far-off look. He kept gazing back toward the pit, as if he thought he had left something in there. That worried me. It reminded me of the little ghost lock, where the victim's willpower is drained by an aggressive spirit, but we'd sealed the source with silver, and there could be no ghost present now. Still, George seemed to be improving. The food was fast reviving him. He shook his head at Lockwood. It wasn't the body, he said slowly. I've seen worse things in our fridge. It was the mirror that he held. You thought it was a mirror then? I said. When I closed my eyes, I still saw that piece of glass, glinting, flashing darker than dark. I don't know what it was, but my eyes were drawn to it. I saw in it. I don't know what I saw. It was all black, basically, but there was something in that blackness, and it was awful. It made me scream. I felt like someone was sucking my insides out through my chest. George shuddered. But at the same time, it was fascinating too. I couldn't take my eyes away. I just wanted to gaze at it, even though it was doing me harm. He gave a long, heartfelt sigh. I'd probably be staring at it now if Lucy hadn't covered it with a net. Good job you're not, by the sounds of it, Lockwood said. He, too, had been watching George closely. Funny sort of mirror. I wonder why they kept it in an iron coffin. Did they know about the properties of iron in Bickerstaff's time? I asked. It was only with the start of the problem, 50 years before, that mass production of ghost-proof materials made of iron and silver had begun. And this burial dated from a generation or two earlier than that. Most people didn't, Lockwood said, but silver, salt, and iron have always been used against ghosts and evil spirits in general. So it can't be a coincidence that we've got iron here. He lowered his voice. Either of you notice anything odd about Dr. Bickerstaff himself, incidentally? Aside from the general mummified corpse angle, you mean? I said. That's just it. According to Joplin's newspaper, Bickerstaff was eaten by rats, wasn't he? That fellow was all in one piece. And did you see the hole in his... He broke off as Saunders and Joplin approached. The excavator had been barking orders at the night watch kids, while the archivist lingered by the iron chains, staring at the coffin. Both had big smiles for us. There was a round of backslapping and congratulations. "Excellent work, Mr. Lockwood," Saunders cried. "Very efficiently done. Perhaps we can get on with our proper business here, now that all this nonsense is over." He took a swig from a steaming mug of coffee. "People are saying old Bickerstaff held a crystal or some such. Something from one of those weird rituals, maybe. But you've got it covered with your net, of course." Lockwood laughed. "You'd want to keep that net in position, believe me. There's certainly some kind of powerful magic source in there. We need to contact Deeprax straight away so we can arrange for their safe disposal." "First thing tomorrow," Saunders said. "Right now, we need to get on with ordinary business. We've lost half a night's work already." "Well, I suppose you want me to sign the papers for your work done, Mr. Lockwood. Come back to the office. We'll get you sorted there." "Can we move the coffin to the chapel tonight?" Joplin asked. "I don't like leaving it out here. There's a danger of thieves and relic men, you know." Lockwood frowned. "Be sure to keep the net in position. Place the chains around it when it's moved, and don't let anyone go near." Lockwood and Saunders departed. George leaned against the box tomb and began an animated conversation with Joplin. I busied myself gathering our equipment, taking my time. It was early yet, not even midnight. Definitely a better evening than the previous one. Strange, though. A very strange burial, and impossible to fathom. George had seen something, but there'd been no tangible ghost at all. Yet, everything that could create so much psychic disturbance, despite all that iron, was formidable indeed. Miss? It was the workman named Norris, the biggest and brawniest of the excavators. His skin was leathery, whitish stubble extended to the buzz cut of his scalp. The tattoo on his neck was a wakeful skull with extended wings. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "Did I hear correctly? No one's to go near the coffin?" "That's right. Better stop your friend, then. Look at him go." I turned. George and Joplin had crossed the iron chains. They'd approached the coffin. They were talking excitedly, Joplin bunching his papers tighter under his arm. "George!" I called. "What on earth are you—" And then I realized. The lid, the inscription. Still chatting blithely, George and Joplin stooped beside the coffin and began chipping away at the mud from the lid. George had his penknife. He raised the lid slightly to aid his work. The silver net was dislodged. It slipped to one side. Norris said something to me, but I didn't hear him, because at that moment I'd become aware of a third figure standing beside Joplin and George. It was still, silent, very tall and thin, and only partially substantial. The iron coffin passed straight through one corner of its long grey robe. Glistening swirls of plasm, short and stubby, like the feelers of anemones, flexed and curled outward from the base of the apparition. But there was no arms or legs, just the plunging robe. Its head, swathed in long, curved hood, could not be seen, except for two details: a pale, sharp chin, dull white as fish bones, and an open mouth of jagged teeth. I opened my mouth and, in the heartbeat it took to shout a warning, I heard a voice speak in my mind. "Look, look! George! I give you your heart's desire. George!" Because he wasn't moving, and neither was Joplin, uh, though the figure was directly in their view, both of them were still, half bent, frozen in the act of brushing the mud off the coffin. Their eyes were wide and staring, their faces transfixed. "Look!" The voice was deep and lulling, and yet so coldly repellent. It muddled my senses. I longed to obey it, but was desperate to defy it too. I forced myself to move, and the figure also moved. It rose up, a great grey column, faint against the stars. Behind me someone shouted, "No time!" I drew my sword. The shape loomed over George and Joplin. All at once they seemed to snap out of their trance. Their heads jerked up, and they stared back. I heard George cry out. Joplin dropped his papers. The figure hung there, frozen in an instant. I knew what it would do. I knew it would suddenly arch down, drop like a falling jet of water. It would engulf them. I would consume them both. I was too far away. Stupid. The rapier was useless. No time to change. No time to reach for anything in my belt. The rapier. The shape dropped down, the mouth open, the teeth descending in an arc. I threw the sword. It spun like a wheel against the sky. Joplin tripped over his own feet in panic and knocked George to the side. George, retreating, fumbling in his belt for some defense, lost his balance and began to fall. I give you your heart's desire. The sword passed directly between George and Joplin, just above their heads. The silver-coated blade sliced first through the cowled face. The figure vanished. The voice in my head cut off. A psychic impact wave spread out from the center of the circle and knocked me off my feet. Lockwood, hair flying, coat flapping, ran past me and down into the pit. He skidded to a halt beside the chains and scanned the scene with glittering eyes. But it was okay. George was okay, and Joplin was okay. The coffin was quiet. The summer stars were shining overhead. The visitor had gone. And that's the end of chapter 7. Thank you for listening.